Hey Nightmares, welcome back. I hope you all are doing well. So, quick disclaimer, I live by train tracks. If there's any cuts and anything that seems a little weird, I have the ability to pause videos and then restart recording. So if a train comes through, I will be pausing, waiting for the train to pass, resuming. I also apologize if I stumble over any words. I have tried to record this video 7 times now, and I've been interrupted by a billion things, and it's just been crazy, really. So I've just been trying to get through this and record this for you. So a little frazzled, a little stressed, but we're good. We're gonna work through it. And tonight, good now, we're gonna be reading Interview with the Vampire. This is one of my favorite books. I'm not certain how many pages I'm gonna read today. I'm just gonna read until it feels like a good place for an intermission, if that makes sense. So, grab your snack, set your alarms, drink some water, and get cozy, and let's read. So part 1. I see, said the vampire thoughtfully, when he slowly walked across the room towards the window. And for a long time he stood there against the dim light from Devisadero Street and the passing beams of traffic, and the boy could see the furnishings of the room more clearly now. The round oak table, the chairs, a wash basin hung on one wall with a mirror. He set his briefcase down on the table and he waited. "But how much tape do you have with you?" asked the vampire, turning now so the boy could see his profile. "Enough for the story of a life?" "Sure, if it's a good life. Sometimes I interview as many as 3 or 4 people a night if I'm lucky. But it has to be a good story. That's only fair, isn't it?" "Admirably fair," the vampire answered. "I would like to tell you the story of my life. I would like to do that very much." "Great," said the boy, and quickly he removed the small tape recorder from the briefcase, making a check of the cassette and the batteries. "I'm really anxious to hear why you believe this, why you—" "No," the vampire said abruptly. "We can't begin that way. Is your equipment ready?" "Yes," said the boy. "Then sit down. I'm going to turn on the overhead light." "But I thought vampires didn't like the light," said the boy. "If you think that adds to the atmosphere—" But he stopped, and the vampire was watching him with his back to the window, and the boy could make out nothing of his face now, and something about that still figure there distracted him. He started to say something again, but then he said nothing, and then sighed with relief when the vampire moved towards the table and reached for the overhead cord. And at once the room was flooded with a harsh yellow light, and the boy, staring up at the vampire, could not repress a gasp. "Dear God," he whispered, and then he gazed, speechless, at the vampire. And the vampire was utterly white and smooth, as if he were sculpted from bleached bone, and his face was seemingly inanimate as a statue, except for 2 brilliant green eyes that looked down at the boy intently, like flames in a skull. But then the vampire smiled wistfully, and the smooth white substance of his face moved with an infinitely flexible but minimal lines of a cartoon. "Do you see?" he asked softly. The boy shuddered, lifting his hand as if to shield himself from a powerful light. Then his eyes moved slowly over the fine, tailored black coat he had only glimpsed in the bar. The lawn folds of the cape and the black silk tie knotted at the throat, and the gleam of the white collar that was as white as the vampire's flesh, and he stared at the vampire's full black hair, and the waves that were combed back over the tips of the ears, and the curls that barely touched the edge of the white collar. "Now, do you still want the interview?" the vampire asked. And the boy's mouth was open before the sound came out, and he was nodding, and he said, "Yes." The vampire sat down opposite him and, leaning forward, said gently, confidently, "Don't be afraid. Just start the tape." And then he reached out over the length of the table, and the boy recoiled, the sweat running down the sides of his face, and the vampire clamped a hand on the boy's shoulder and said, "Believe me, I won't hurt you. I want this opportunity. It is more important to me than you can realize now." "I want you to begin." And he withdrew his hand, and he sat collected, waiting. It took a moment for the boy to wipe his forehead and his lips with a handkerchief, to stammer that the microphone was in the machine, to press the button and say that the machine was on. "You weren't always a vampire, were you?" he began. "No," answered the vampire. "I was a 25-year-old man when I became a vampire, and the year was 1791. And the boy was startled by the preciseness of the date, and he repeated it before he asked, "How did it come about?" "Well, there's a simple answer to that, and I don't believe I want to give simple answers. I think I want to tell the real story." "Yes," the boy said quickly, as he folded his handkerchief over and over, wiping his lips with it now and again. "There was a tragedy." The vampire started. "He was my younger brother. He died." And then he stopped, so that the boy cleared his throat, and he wiped his face again before stuffing the handkerchief almost impatiently into his pocket. "It's not painful, is it?" he asked timidly. "Does it seem so?" asked the vampire. "No." He shook his head. "It's simply that I've only told this story to one other person, and that was so long ago. No, it's not painful. We were living in Louisiana then, and we received a land grant and settled 2 indigo plantations on the Mississippi, very near New Orleans." "Ah, that's the accent," the boy said softly. And for a moment, the vampire stared blankly. "I have an accent?" He began to laugh, and the boy, flustered, answered quickly, "I noticed it in the bar when I asked you what you did for a living. It's just a slight sharpness to the consonants, that's all. I never guessed it was French." "It's all right," the vampire assured him. "I'm not as shocked as I pretend to be. It's only that I forget from time to time. But let me go on." "Please," said the boy. "I was talking about the plantations. They had a great deal to do with it, really, my becoming a vampire, but I'll come to that. Our life was both luxurious and primitive, and we ourselves found it extremely attractive. You see, we lived far better there and than we ever could have in France, and perhaps the sheer wilderness of Louisiana made it only seem so, but seeming so, it was. And I remember the imported furniture that cluttered the house." The vampire smiled. "And the harpsichord. That was lovely." My sister used to play it. On summer evenings, she would sit at the keys with her back to the open French windows, and I could still remember that thin, rapid music, and the vision of the swamp rising beyond her, and the moss-hung cypresses floating against the sky, and there were sounds of the swamp and a chorus of creatures and the cry of the birds, and I think we loved it. It made the rosewood furniture all the more precious, and the music more delicate and desirable, and even when the wisteria tore the shutters off the attic windows and worked its tendrils right into the whitewashed brick in less than a year, yes, we still loved it. All except my brother, and I don't think I ever heard him complain of anything, but I knew how he felt. My father was dead then, and I was head of the household, head of the family. And I had to defend him constantly when my mother and sister, they wanted to take him visiting and to New Orleans for parties. But he had hated those things, and I think he had stopped going altogether before he was 12. Prayer was what mattered to him. Prayer and his leather-bound Lives of the Saints. Finally, I had built him an oratory removed from the house, and he began to spend most every day there, and often into the early evening. It was ironic, really. He was so different from us, so different from everyone, and I was so regular. There was nothing extraordinary about me whatsoever, the vampire smiled. Sometimes in the evening, I would go out to him and find him in the garden near the oratory, sitting absolutely composed on a stone bench there, and I would tell him my troubles, the difficulties I had with the slaves, how I distrusted the overseer, or the weather, or my brokers. All the problems that made up the length and breadth of my existence. And he would listen, only making a few comments, always sympathetic, so that when I left him, I had the distinct impression that he had solved everything for me, and I don't think I could deny him anything, and I vowed that no matter how it would break my heart to lose him, that he would enter the priesthood when the time came, and of course I was wrong. The vampire stopped, and for a moment the boy only gazed at him, and then he started as if awakened from a deep thought, and he floundered as if he could not find the right words. He didn't want to be a priest, the boy asked, and the vampire studied him as if trying to discern the meaning of his expression, and then he said, I meant that I was wrong about myself, about not denying him anything. And his eyes moved over the far wall and fixed on the panes of the window, and he began to see visions. Real visions? The boy asked, but then again there was hesitation, as if he were thinking of something else. I don't think so, the vampire answered. It happened when he was 15, and he was handsome then. He had the smoothest skin and the largest blue eyes. He was robust and not thin as I am now, and then, but his eyes. It was as if when I looked into his eyes, I was standing alone on the edge of the world, on a windswept ocean beach, and there was nothing but the soft roar of the waves. Well, he said, his eyes still fixed on the window panes. He began to see visions, and he only hinted at this at first, and then he had stopped taking his meals altogether. He lived in the oratory, and at any hour of day or night I could find him on the bare flagstones, kneeling before the altar. And the oratory itself was neglected. He had stopped tending to the candles, or changing the altar cloths, or even sweeping out the leaves. And one night I became really alarmed. When I stood in the rose arbor, watching him for 1 solid hour, and during which he never even moved from his knees. He never once lowered his arms, which were held outstretched into the form of a cross. The slaves all thought he was mad, and the vampire raised his eyebrows in wonder. I was convinced he was only overzealous, that in his love for God, perhaps he had gone too far. Then he had told me about the visions both St. Dominic and the Blessed Virgin Mary had come to him in the oratory. They had told him he was to sell our property in Louisiana, everything we owned, and use the money to do God's work in France. My brother was to be a great religious leader. To return the country to its former fervor, to turn the tide against atheism and the revolution, and of course, he had no money of his own. I was to sell the plantations and our townhouses in New Orleans and give the money to him. Again, the vampire stopped, and the boy sat motionless regarding him, astonished. Excuse me, he whispered. What did you say? Did you sell the plantations? No, said the vampire, his face calm as it had been from the start. I laughed at him, and he became incensed. He insisted his command came from the Virgin herself. Who was I to disregard it? Who indeed? And the more he tried to convince me, the more I laughed. It was nonsense, I told him. The product of an immature and even morbid mind. And the oratory was a mistake, I said to him, that I would have it torn down at once, that he would go to school in New Orleans, and he would get such inane notions out of his head. I don't remember all that I said, but I remember the feeling. Behind all this contemptuous dismissal, on my part, was a smoldering anger and a disappointment, and I was bitterly disappointed. I didn't believe him at all. But that's understandable, said the boy quickly, and the vampire paused, and his expression of astonishment softening. I mean, would anyone have believed him? Is it so understandable? The vampire looked at the boy. I think perhaps it's a vicious egotism. Let me explain. I loved my brother, as I told you, and at times I believed him to be a living saint, and I encouraged him in his prayer and meditations. As I said, I was willing to give him up to priesthood, and someone had told me of a saint in Arles or Lens where he saw visions. I would have believed it. I was a Catholic, and I believed in saints, and I lit tapers before their marble statues in churches. I knew their pictures, their symbols, their names, but I couldn't believe my brother. Not only did I not believe he saw visions, I couldn't entertain the notion for a moment. Now why? Because he was my brother, and holy he might be, peculiar most definitely, but Francis of Assisi? No, not my brother. No brother of mine could be such. That is egotism, do you see? And the boy thought about it before, and he answered, and then he nodded and said that yes, he thought that he did. Perhaps he saw visions, said the vampire. Then you do not claim to know now whether he did or not? No, but I do know that he never wavered in his conviction for a second. That I know now. He knew the night that he left my room, crazed and grieved. He never wavered for an instant, and within minutes he was dead. How? The boy asked. He simply walked out of the French doors onto the gallery, and he stood for a moment at the head of the brick stairs, and then he fell, and he was dead when I reached the bottom, his neck broken. And the vampire shook his head in consternation, but his face was still serene. Did you see him fall? Asked the boy. Did he lose his footing? No, But 2 of the servants saw it happen, and they said he had looked up as if he had just saw something in the air, and then his entire body moved forward, as if being swept by a wind, and one of them said he was about to say something when he fell, and I thought that he was about to say something too. But it was at that moment that I had turned away from the window, and my back was turned when I heard the noise, and he glanced at the tape recorder. I could not forgive myself. I felt responsible for his death, he said, and everyone else seemed to think I was responsible also. But how could they? You said they saw him fall? It wasn't a direct accusation. They simply knew that something had passed between us that was unpleasant, that we had argued minutes before the fall, that the servants had heard us, my mother had heard us. My mother would not stop asking me whether it had happened or what had happened, and my brother, who was so quiet, had been shouting, and then my sister joined in, and of course I refused to say. I was so bitterly shocked and miserable, and I had no patience with anyone. Only the vague determination they would not know about his visions. They would not know that he had become finally not a saint but a fanatic. My sister went to bed rather than face the funeral, and my mother had told everyone in the parish that something horrible had happened in my room, which I would not reveal. The police even questioned me, and on the word of my own mother, finally, the priest came to see me and demanded to know what had gone on. I told no one. It was only a discussion, I said. I was not on the gallery when he fell. I protested, and they all stared at me as if I killed him. And I felt that I'd killed him. I sat in the parlor beside his coffin for 2 days thinking, I have killed him, and I stared at his face until spots appeared before my eyes, and I nearly fainted, and the back of his skull had been shattered on the pavement, and his head had been the wrong shape on the pillow. And I forced myself to stare at it, to study it, simply because I could hardly endure the pain and the smell of decay, and I was tempted over and over to try and open his eyes. All these were mad thoughts, mad impulses. The main thought was this. I had laughed at him. I had not believed him, and I had not been kind to him. He had fallen because of me. This really happened, didn't it? The boy whispered. You're telling me something. It's true. Yes, said the vampire, looking at him without surprise. I want to go on telling you. But as his eyes passed over the boy and returned to the window, he showed only faint interest in the boy, who seemed engaged in some silent inner struggle. But you said you didn't know about the visions, that you, a vampire, didn't know for certain whether... I want to take things in order, said the vampire. I want to go on telling you things as they happened. No, I don't know about the visions to this day. And again, he waited until the boy said, Yes, please go on. Well, I wanted to sell the plantations. I never wanted to see the house or the oratory again, and I leased them finally to an agency which would work them for me and would manage things so I would never go there, never need to go there. And I moved my mother and my sister to one of the townhouses in New Orleans, and of course, I did not escape my brother for a moment. I could think of nothing but his body rotting in the ground. He was buried in the St. Louis Cemetery in New Orleans, and I did everything to avoid passing those gates, and still I thought of him constantly, drunk or sober, and I saw his body rotting in the coffin. And I couldn't bear it. and over again I had dreamed that he was at the head of the steps, and I was holding his arm, talking kindly to him, and urging him back to the bedroom, telling him gently that I did believe him, that he must pray for me, to have faith, and in the meantime the slaves on the Point du Lac, that was my plantation, had begun to talk of seeing his ghost on the gallery, and the overseer couldn't keep order, and people in society asked my sister offensive questions about the whole incident, and she became hysteric. She wasn't really hysteric. She simply thought she ought to act the way, or react that way, so she did. I drank all the time, and that I was at home, and I was at home as little as possible, and I lived like a man who wanted to die, but who had no courage to do it himself. And I walked back streets and alleyways alone, and I passed out in cabarets, and I backed out of 2 duels more from apathy than cowardice, and I truly wished to be murdered, that I was attacked. It might have been anyone. My invitation was open to sailors, thieves, maniacs, anyone. But it was a vampire who caught me just a few steps from my door one night and left me for dead, or so I thought. You mean he sucked your blood? The boy asked. Yes, the vampire laughed. He sucked my blood. That's the way it's done. But you lived, said the young man. You said he left you for dead. Well, he drained me almost to the point of death, which was for him sufficient. And I was put to bed as soon as I was found, and confused and really unaware of what had happened to me. I supposed I thought I had drank and finally caused a stroke. I expected to die now, and had no interest in eating or drinking or talking to the doctor. My mother sent for the priest, and I was feverish by then, and I told the priest everything about my brother's visions and what I had done. And I remember I clung to his arm, making him swear over and over that he would tell no one. I know I didn't kill him, I said to the priest finally. It's that I cannot live now that he's dead, not after the way I treated him. That's ridiculous, he answered me. Of course you can live. There's nothing wrong with it. But your self-indulgence, your mother needs you, not to mention your sister, and as for this brother of yours, he was possessed of the devil. And I was so stunned when he said this that I couldn't protest. The devil made the visions, and he went on to explain that the devil was rampant and the entire country of France was under the influence of the devil. And the revolution had been his greatest triumph. Nothing would have saved my brother but exorcism, prayer, and fasting. Men to hold him down while the devil raged in his body, and he tried to throw him about. The devil threw you down the steps. They threw him down the steps. It's perfectly obvious, he declared. You weren't talking to your brother in that room, you were talking to the devil. Well, this enraged me, and I believed that before I had been pushed to my limits, but I had not. He went on talking about the devil, about voodoo amongst the slaves, and the cases of possessions in other parts of the world. And I went wild, and I wrecked the room in the process of nearly killing him. But your strength, the vampire, asked the boy. I was out of my mind. The vampire explained. I did things I could not have done in perfect health. The scene is confused, pale, fantastical now, but I do remember that I drove him out of the back doors of the house, across the courtyard, against the brick wall of the kitchen, where I pounded his head until I nearly killed him. And when I was subdued finally, and exhausted and almost to the point of death, they bled me. The fools. But I was going to say something else. It was then I was conceived of my own egotism. Perhaps I had seen it reflected in the priest, and his contemptuous attitude towards my brother reflected my own. His immediate and shallow carping about the devil, his refusal to even entertain the idea. But the sanctity had passed so close. But he did believe in possession by the devil? That is a much more mundane idea, said the vampire. The vampire immediately. That is much more. I'm so sorry. I'm so tired. That is a much more mundane idea, said the vampire immediately. People who cease to believe in God or goodness altogether still believe in the devil, and I don't know why. No, I do indeed know why. Evil is always possible, and goodness is eternally difficult. But you must understand that possession is really another way of saying someone is mad. I felt it was for the priest. I'm sure he'd seen madness. Perhaps he had stood right over raving madness and pronounced it possession. You don't have to see Satan when he is exorcised, but to stand in the presence of a saint. To believe that the saint has seen a vision, no, it's egotism. Our refusal to believe that it could concur in our midst. I never thought of it that way, said the boy. But what happened to you? You said they bled you to cure you? That must have nearly killed you. The vampire laughed. Yes, it certainly did. But the vampire came back that night, you see. He wanted Pointe du Lac, my plantation. It was very late. After my sister had fallen asleep, I can remember it as if it were yesterday. He came in from the courtyard, opening the French doors without a sound. A tall, fair-skinned man with a mass of blonde hair and a graceful, almost feline quality to his movements, and gently he draped a shawl over my sister's eyes, and he lowered the wick of the lamp. She dozed there beside the basin in the cloth which she had bathed my forehead, and she never once stirred under that shawl until morning. And but that time I was greatly changed. What was this change? Asked the boy. And the vampire sighed. He leaned back against the chair, and he looked at the walls. At first I thought he was a doctor or someone summoned by family to try to reason with me, but this suspicion was removed at once. He stepped close to my bed, and he leaned down so that his face was in the lamplight, and I saw that he was no ordinary man at all. His gray eyes burned with an incandescence, and long white hands, which hung by his sides, that were not those of a human being. And I think I knew everything in that instant. And all that he told me was only aftermath. What I mean is, the moment I saw him, saw his extraordinary aura, and I knew him to be no creature I'd ever known. I was reduced to nothing. That ego, which could not accept the presence of an extraordinary human being in its midst, was crushed. All my conceptions, even my guilt and my wish to die, seemed utterly unimportant. I completely forgot myself. He said, now silently touching his breast with his fist, I forgot myself totally. And in that same instant knew totally the meaning of possibility. And from then on, I experienced only increasing wonder. And as he talked to me and told me of what I might become, of what his life had been and stood to be, my past shrank to embers, and I saw my life as if I stood apart from it. The vanity, the self-serving, the constant fleeing from one pretty annoyance to another. The lip service to God, the Virgin, and a host of saints whose names filled my prayer books, none of whom made the slightest difference in a narrow, materialistic, and selfish existence. I saw my real gods, the gods of most men: food, drink, and security and comfort, cinders. The boy's face was tense with a mixture of confusion and amazement. "And so you decided to become a vampire?" he asked, and the vampire was silent for a moment. "Decided doesn't seem like the right word." "No, indeed. Yet I cannot say it was inevitable from the moment that he stepped into that room. It was not inevitable. Yet I can't say I'd decided. Let me say that when he had finished speaking, no other decision was possible for me. And I pursued my course without a backward glance except for one. Except for one what? My last sunrise, said the vampire. And that morning I was not yet a vampire, and I saw my last sunrise, and I remember it completely, and yet I don't think I remember any other sunrise before it. I remember the light coming first to the tops of the French windows and a paling behind the lace curtains, and then a gleam glowing brighter and brighter in patches among the leaves of the trees. And finally, the sun came through the windows themselves, and the lace lay in shadows on the stone floor and all over the form of my sister, who was still sleeping, and the lace shawl over her shoulders and head, and as soon as she was warm, she pushed the shawl away without awakening, and the sun shone full on her eyes and on her tightened eyelids, and then it was gleaming on the table where she rested her head on her arms, and the gleaming, blazing, in the water and the picture, and I could feel it on my hands, and on the counterpane, and then on my face, and I lay in that bed, thinking about all the things the vampire had told me. And then it was that day that I said goodbye to the sunrise, and I sought out to become a vampire, and it was the last sunrise. The vampire was looking out the window again, and then he stopped, and the silence was so sudden, the boy seemed to hear it. He could hear the noises from the street, and the sound of a truck that was deafening, and the light cord stirred with vibration, and the truck was gone. "Do you miss it?" he said in a small voice. "Not really," said the vampire. "There are so many other things. But where are we? You want to know how it happened? How I became a vampire?" "Yes," said the boy. "How did you change exactly?" "I can't tell you exactly," said the vampire, "but I can tell you about it, and close it with words that will make the value of it to me evident to you. But I can't tell you exactly anymore. I could tell you exactly what it was, the experience of sex, if you ever had it, or never had it." And the young man seemed struck suddenly with still another question, but before he could speak, the vampire went on. "As I told you, the vampire Lestat wanted the plantation. A mundane reason, surely, for granting me a life that will last until the end of the world. But he was not a very discriminating person. He didn't consider the world's small population of vampires as being a select club. I should say, he had human problems, a blind father who did not know about his son being a vampire, and he must not find out. Living in New Orleans would become too difficult for him considering his needs and the necessity to care for his father. But he had wanted Pointe du Lac. We had went once to the plantation. The next evening, ensconced with the blind father in the master bedroom, and I proceeded to make the change, and I cannot say that it consisted in one step, really, though, of course, was the step beyond which I could make no return. And there were several acts involved, but the first was the death of the overseer. Lestat took him in his sleep, and I was to watch and to approve, that is, to witness the taking of a human life as proof of my commitment and part of my change, and this proving, without a doubt, to be the most difficult part for me. And I've told you, I had no fear regarding my own death, only a squeamishness about taking life itself, my life itself. But I had almost a high regard for the life of others, and a horror of death which most recently developed because of my brother. And I had to watch the overseer awake with a start and try to throw Lestat off with both hands, fail, and lie there struggling under Lestat's grasp, and finally go limp, drained of blood, and die. He did not die at once. We stood in his narrow bedroom for the better part of an hour, watching him die. Part of my change, as I had said, Lestat would have never stayed otherwise. Then it was necessary to get rid of the overseer's body, and I was almost sick from doing this. Weak and feverish already, I had little reserve, and handling the dead body with such purpose caused me nausea. Lestat was laughing, telling me callously that I would feel so different once I was a vampire. I would laugh too, and he was wrong about that. I never laughed at death, no matter how often and how regularly I am the cause of it. But let me take things in order. We had to drive up to the river road until we came to the open fields and leave the overseer there. We tore his coat, stole his money, and saw to it his lips were stained with liquor. I knew his wife, who lived in New Orleans, and knew the state of desperation she would suffer when the body was discovered. But more than sorrow for her, I felt pain that she would never know what happened, that her husband had not been found drunk on the road by robbers. As we beat the body and bruising the face and the shoulders, and I became more and more aroused, of course. You must realize that all in this time, the vampire Lestat was extraordinary. He was no more human to me than a biblical angel. But under this pressure, my enchantment with him was strained, and I had seen my becoming a vampire in two lights. The first light was simply enchantment. Lestat had overwhelmed me on my deathbed. But the other light was my wish for self-destruction, my desire to be thoroughly damned. This was an open door, though, which Lestat had come on both the first and second occasion, and now I was not destroying myself, but with someone else, the overseer, his wife, and his family. I recoiled and may have fled from Lestat, but my sanity, thoroughly shattered, had not been sensed with an infallible instinct what was happening. Infallible instinct, the vampire amused. Let me say that the powerful instinct of a vampire, to whom even the slightest change in a vampire's facial expression is as apparent as a gesture. Lestat had preternatural timing. He rushed me into the carriage, and he whipped the horses home. I want to die. I began to murmur, this is unbearable, I want to die. You have it in your power to kill me. Let me die. I refused to look at him, to be spellbound by the sheer beauty of his appearance. He spoke my name to me softly, laughing, as I said he was determined to have the plantation. I think that's gonna be a good stopping point for tonight. So this leaves us with Louis setting off to become a vampire. I hope you enjoyed my reading. And of course, if you have any book request, please let me know. I have, I think, just about every Anne Rice book. But it's been a pleasure to sit and read with you, even if for a little while. I hope you all have a lovely evening, a lovely day, a lovely week. And next week, our video will be the Wheel of the Year tarot card reading. I'm excited to show you that deck. So, this is good night and sweet dreams.